The morning my wife announced she was leaving me, she was wearing a new dress I'd never seen before. Not new as in recent, new as in purchased for someone else's approval. The tags were gone, but the fabric still held that particular stiffness of something worn for the first time. I noticed because I spent 31 years as a fraud examiner for the IRS. Noticing things other people overlook is not a skill I developed. It is simply what I am. She came downstairs while I was making coffee. She had her hair done. Not the way she wore it for church or family dinners, but the way she used to when we were dating. Loose. Deliberate. She set her purse on the counter and told me she wanted a divorce. I said okay. She blinked. That was not the response she expected. She had prepared for anger, for begging, for the kind of scene that would confirm whatever story she had been telling herself about why leaving was justified. I gave her none of that. I poured my coffee, asked if she wanted a cup, and when she said no, I nodded and sat down at the kitchen table with the newspaper. She stood there for another 30 seconds. Then she picked up her purse and left for work. I sat with my coffee until it went cold. I want to be clear about something. I am 63 years old. I retired 2 years ago after 3 decades of following money through shell accounts, falsified returns, and offshore holdings that people thought were invisible. My wife, Eleanor, had been a paralegal for most of our marriage, then moved into corporate compliance work about 8 years back. We had one daughter, Cassandra, who lived 40 minutes away with her husband and our 2 grandchildren. We had a house we owned outright in Raleigh, North Carolina. We had a retirement portfolio, a joint savings account, and what I had believed until approximately 6 months before that morning was a stable marriage. What changed 6 months prior was a Sunday afternoon when Eleanor left her personal laptop open on the kitchen counter while she went to answer the door. I was not snooping. I walked past and saw a name on the screen that I recognized. Not because it was someone from her office, because it was someone from mine. Or rather, from a case I had consulted on after retirement. A quiet referral from my former supervisor. A man named Whitfield who ran a small investment advisory firm in Durham. I kept walking. I did not say anything that day, but I started paying attention. Eleanor had always handled her own finances separately. We had joint accounts for household expenses and individual accounts for personal spending, which had been her preference from early in our marriage and which I had always respected. I respected it less, looking back, than I should have questioned it. But 30 years of trusting someone builds a certain kind of blindness. Over the following weeks, I began to notice the pattern of her absences. Not dramatic disappearances, small ones. An extra hour here. A conference she attended that I couldn't find listed on her firm's public calendar. Charges on our joint credit card for restaurants in parts of the city she had no work reason to visit. I did not confront her. I observed. What I found when I looked more carefully was not what I expected. Eleanor had been doing compliance work for Whitfield's firm. That was not a secret. She had mentioned it as a consulting contract about 3 years back. What she had not mentioned was that the consulting had evolved into something else. And what that something else had produced was a financial arrangement that my professional eye recognized immediately for what it was. Whitfield's firm managed money for a cluster of clients who existed, on paper, as real estate investors. The properties were real. The valuations were not. Eleanor had been certifying compliance documentation that allowed those valuations to pass through to lenders and insurers at numbers that bore no relationship to the actual market assessments. It was not complicated fraud. It was the kind of fraud that works because it involves enough legitimate paperwork to make reviewers complacent. I had seen it 100 times in 30 years. I did not know yet what Eleanor's role was, knowing participant or useful fool. I was not ready to make that determination. What I knew was that I had spent a career sending people to federal prison for exactly this, and my wife's signature was on documents that formed part of the architecture. I called an old colleague, not to report anything, to think out loud with someone who understood the landscape. His first question was whether I had retained an attorney. I had not. He told me to do that before anything else. Before I said another word to Eleanor, before I made any financial moves, before I contacted anyone official, he said it with the calm of someone who has seen what happens to people who try to handle this kind of situation themselves. I called a divorce attorney the next morning, a woman my daughter's husband had used professionally and trusted. I drove to her office and sat across from her and explained the situation in the same methodical way I would have documented a case file. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked several precise questions, took 4 pages of notes, and told me we needed to move carefully and quickly. What I did not tell Eleanor through all of this was any of it. That was the hardest part. Not because I wanted to confront her. Because we had been married for 31 years and some part of me kept waiting for an explanation that would make this make sense. That part of me had to be set aside. I had learned, professionally, that the explanation almost never makes it make sense. It just adds detail to the picture of how someone convinced themselves that what they were doing was acceptable. I began organizing our financial records. Everything joint, everything I had legal access to, documented and copied and stored in a place that was not our home. I was methodical about it. I opened a separate personal account at a bank I did not use and transferred my pension deposits going forward. I had the legal right to do this. My attorney confirmed it. Cassandra called me on a Thursday evening in March. She asked if I was eating, which was her way of asking if I was okay without asking directly, because she had inherited her mother's avoidance of direct conversation and my habit of stating problems in oblique terms. I told her I was eating fine. I asked about the grandchildren. We talked for 20 minutes and I didn't tell her anything. It was the right call. She did not need to carry what I was carrying before the facts were settled. The months between that first morning and the filing were the quietest of my life. Eleanor and I moved through the house like 2 people, maintaining a shared but separate project. She was not unkind. She was not present either. She spent more evenings out than in, and I stopped asking where she was going, because I already knew the texture of the answer without needing the specifics. She was living a version of her life she had decided I was not part of. I worked in my home office in the evenings. I had kept professional contacts at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and I had a standing arrangement since retirement as an informal expert consultant on specific case types. I was careful not to use those relationships for anything personal. What I did was prepare. I organized everything I had documented into a clean reference package, and I gave it to my attorney, who gave it to a colleague she trusted who specialized in financial crime. It was not my job to report Eleanor. It was my job to protect myself. But a report was made independent of me by a lender who had grown suspicious of the Whitfield valuations. That investigation was already underway by the time our divorce filing became public. I did not know the timing would align the way it did, I will be honest. If I had known, I would not have changed my approach. I had done what I was supposed to do in the correct order. What happened after that was not mine to manage. The divorce petition was filed in April. Eleanor received the papers at her office. She called me that evening, and for the first time in months she sounded like herself. Not the performed version she had been presenting, but the actual person I had married. Surprised, a little frightened, she asked if we could talk. I said we could have our attorneys talk. She did not like that. She said she thought we were past that kind of formality, which I found interesting given that formality was the only honest framework left between us. She said she wanted to settle this civilly. I told her I intended to settle it correctly, which was not the same thing. Her attorney contacted mine within the week. The initial position she took on the marital assets was aggressive. She was claiming half of the retirement portfolio, the house, a significant portion of my pension, and she was arguing that my consulting income since retirement constituted marital earnings she was entitled to offset. Her attorney was good. The position was not unreasonable on its surface. My attorney was better. She had spent the previous months building a picture that accounted for the financial irregularities in Eleanor's own accounts. The consulting fees from Whitfield's firm that had not been disclosed on our joint tax returns, the accounts Eleanor had maintained that she had not listed in her initial financial disclosure. When my attorney presented this at our first formal mediation session, Eleanor's attorney asked for a recess. They came back 30 minutes later with a revised position. I did not feel triumphant in that room. I want to be clear about that too. 31 years does not become nothing because the last 18 months of it were a deception. I felt tired. I felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding a complicated thing for too long and is finally setting it down. That is not the same as winning. It is just what the end of something feels like. The house went to me. The retirement portfolio was divided, but not evenly. Her undisclosed income was factored into the calculation. A claim on my pension was denied. She retained her personal accounts, which by that point had been partially frozen pending the federal inquiry. That inquiry, I will tell you what I know, which is not everything. The Whitfield matter moved through the federal system in the way these things move, slowly, procedurally, with a thoroughness that the public rarely sees and that the people involved find excruciating. Eleanor was interviewed twice, as far as I know, as a potential witness and as a subject of interest. Her attorney, a different one from the divorce, a criminal defense specialist she retained in May, advised her throughout. Whether she knew the full scope of what Whitfield's firm was doing, I genuinely do not know. She was not, as far as the outcome revealed, found to have been a knowing architect of the fraud. The determination made by the government was that she had been negligent in her compliance certifications, that she had not performed the due diligence her role required, and that this negligence had been compounded by the personal relationship that compromised her professional judgment. She was not indicted. She was sanctioned by the Professional Compliance Board and surrendered her certification. She cannot work in compliance or paralegal functions that involve financial documentation for a period of 5 years. For a woman of her professional standing, that was not a light consequence. Whitfield and 2 of his associates were indicted. That case is ongoing as far as I know. I moved out of the Rayleigh house in late summer and into a smaller place closer to Cassandra and the grandchildren. A ranch house on a quiet street with a covered porch where I can sit in the evening and hear absolutely nothing except what is actually there. I got rid of a lot of furniture I had never particularly liked. I bought a reading chair that is comfortable in a way my previous one never was. These are small things. They are not small things. Cassandra found out the full shape of what had happened in pieces over several conversations, the way adult children learn difficult truths about their parents. Not all at once, because all at once would be too much, but in installments that allow them to adjust. She was angry at her mother, first, then at me briefly, for not telling her sooner. That anger passed faster than I expected. She is practical in the way that people become practical when they have small children and finite energy for things they cannot change. The grandchildren visited me last month for a full weekend. We went to a minor league baseball game on Saturday, and I bought them both too much ballpark food and pretended not to notice when they couldn't finish it. On Sunday morning I made pancakes, the same recipe I've used since Cassandra was small, and my grandson asked me if I could teach him to make them, and I said yes. And we stood at the stove together, and I showed him how to know when to flip by watching the edges rather than the top. My former wife and I do not speak. There is nothing that requires speech between us at this point. What there was to resolve has been resolved through appropriate channels and appropriate representation, which is exactly how it should work. The law exists precisely so that people in untenable situations do not have to rely on the goodwill of someone who has already demonstrated they are not operating in good faith. I think about the morning she walked downstairs in that new dress sometimes, not with anger, with a kind of professional clarity I wish I had applied sooner. Every fraud I ever investigated had a moment like that, a detail that was visible to anyone paying attention, that the people closest to the situation had rationalized or overlooked. I overlooked it. I am honest enough with myself to say that the love we have for people is not a failure of intelligence. It is just a particular blindness that comes with having invested yourself fully in another person's story. What I know now, at 63, with a comfortable reading chair and a porch and pancake mornings with my grandson, is this: The same skills that let me spend 30 years following money through the places people try to hide it are the skills that protected me when the person I least expected turned out to be hiding something too. I did not enjoy any of it. I'm glad I did all of it correctly. That distinction matters more than people realize. Not winning. Doing it right. Those are different things, and at my age, the difference is the only part that stays with you. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows the end of something you spent decades building. It is not peaceful exactly. It is just empty in a way that takes time to learn to sit with. I think about Eleanor sometimes, not with bitterness, but with the honest clarity that only comes after enough distance. She was not a villain in some simple story. She was a person who made choices, one at a time, each one small enough to seem manageable, until the accumulation became something neither of us could ignore. That is how most things fall apart, not in one dramatic moment, but in the slow drift of small decisions that compound like interest on a debt no one wants to acknowledge. What saved me, and I mean that in the plainest possible sense, was not luck. It was the habit of integrity I had built over 30 years of professional work. I had spent my career insisting that the truth of a financial picture matters, regardless of how inconvenient it is to the person presenting it. When that same principle turned on my own life, I had no choice but to apply it consistently. That is what integrity actually costs. Not the easy cases, the ones we would genuinely prefer to look away. I did not handle this perfectly. I want to be honest about that. There were months where I convinced myself that observation was enough, that clarity would arrive on its own, that a man who had caught fraud in federal investigations should surely be able to manage the truth of his own marriage. The skill I had was real. The willingness to use it on myself took longer than it should have. That gap between what we know and what we are willing to act on is where most people lose the ground they could have held. The discipline to act when acting is hard is something I used to think of as a professional quality, a work attribute. Sitting on that porch in the evenings now, I understand it differently. It is a life quality. The people who come through difficulty intact are not the ones who felt no fear or grief or confusion. They are the ones who did the necessary thing anyway, in the right order, through the right channels, without letting emotion override judgment. I did that. Not gracefully, but I did it. And the decency to protect Cassandra until the facts were settled, to avoid poisoning her relationship with her mother before the picture was complete, that mattered too. It would have been easier to tell her. Easier for me, in the sense that carrying something alone is exhausting, but it would not have been right. The people we love are not repositories for the weight we don't want to carry alone. They deserve the truth at the moment it can actually help them, not before, when it can only wound. What I know now, and what I would tell anyone sitting across from me in a situation like the one I came through, is this. The outcome of a hard situation is almost always determined before the hardest moment arrives. By the choices made quietly, before anyone was watching. By the records kept, by the counsel sought. By the patience maintained when patience felt impossible. Cassandra asked me recently whether I was happy. I told her I was something more durable than happy. I was settled. I was clear. I knew exactly who I was and what I had done, and I could account for all of it. At 63, that is more than enough.